Oh hey. Let's talk about combat. I think we can all generally agree that combat is one of our favorite skills in the game. Primarily because it's the one that's most like a video game. Just to make sure we're on the same page here, video games are supposed to be fun at the end of the day, not Carpal Tunnel Speedrun 2000. It's arguably one of the most creative skills in the game because it doesn't ultimately boil down to mining blocks for an infinite amount of time. But we needn't waste any more time, so let's start at the start. So in the summer of 2019, people began playing everybody's favorite little MMORPG. And like most MMORPGs, it focused a lot on PvE elements. Certainly a lot of what we know skyblock to be today existed at the time, such as riches and skills, but in this very innocent and naive era, it wasn't that much of a priority. The primary focus at the time, and certainly still is today, is to get the big gear to get the big damage. So our story first brings us here to the Lapis mines, where everybody probably has an experience taking down tons of these different zombies to get the Lapis armor. I mean, I guess you could consider the Colosseum to be one of the first areas, but this place has certainly seen better days. The place has taken such a nosedive that the Colosseum gladiator not only spends all of his time here in the pub, but he's too ashamed to show himself on the main floor. He just sits up here all by himself on the top floor when nobody will see him. One day he will rise again, but unfortunately that day is not today. At the time, it was all about defeating the enemies in the Obsidian Sanctuary because there wasn't really any mobs on any other islands, at least certainly not ones worth caring about. Now, it's not to say that combat lacked any kind of complexity, because there certainly was some. Your armor could contribute to your overall tankiness as well as your ability to do damage. In addition to that, of course, you could reforge your items to give them extra bonuses. But all in all, it was pretty similar to vanilla Minecraft. I mean, sure, you could do things like block hit and straight line and all that type of stuff, but ultimately at the end of the day, the thing that mattered was your stats. Sure, there were some incentives to up your damage, such as the magma boss, but ultimately at the end of the day, it didn't really matter too much. But everything changed when the End Island came out. An update considered by some to be the greatest update of Hypixel Skyblock. It effectively standardized the way everybody played the game up until that point. Everybody knew the specific build you needed regarding armor as well as your weapons. Everybody knew the purpose of that stuff in order to fight the big boss. And subsequently, everybody knew they had to fight the big boss so they could make the big money. This era could be considered the Dragon era, as before this, there was stuff like water Hydra heads and that type of stuff, but when Dragon sets hit the scene, everybody had to get them. There were some specialty sets that were used for specific niche purposes, such as Young and Wise armor. There were some sets for tanking if you were into that sort of thing, like Protector and Old, and of course some budget-friendly sets like Unstable and Strong. But none were as important to the game as Superior was, unanimously considered at the time to be the best armor in the game. At the time, and maybe even still today, this was the face of Hypixel Skyblock. There was no other armor sets or even image that was more prolific and synonymous with Hypixel Skyblock than the Superior Dragon armor set. In the modern day, of course, power creep has certainly taken its toll on it though. But once upon a time in an era hopefully not forgotten, this was the face of Hypixel Skyblock, the Superior Dragon armor along with the 50mm Midas sword. Which is what I'm definitely holding in my hands here. Don't look too much into that. But like most things in Hypixel Skyblock, it ultimately boiled down to doing really monotonous things for a very unhealthy amount of time. You just simply run around killing zealots so you can get summoning eyes to ultimately spawn the dragon. As stated previously, combat was more or less just vanilla Minecraft, but some MMORPG elements thrown in there. But with the End update, it became a true skill. There were also a variety of strategies that were discovered along the way, such as using tarantula armor or tux dropping. And even though dragons were a total money sink even at the time, it was still more or less pretty fun because at the end of the day, you were still fighting a big scary dragon boss. I mean, how can that not be exciting? Unless of course you were one of those people developing early arthritis because of your 12 million CPS tux dropping. It's safe to say that the admins had struck gold with this update tier, so they were like, okay, so the player base likes to fight the big scary bosses, they like the fact that it's super monotonous and takes tons of time, and they like the fact that it's a big money sink. And thus the Slayer update was born. The update initially released with the first 3 Slayers being Zombie, Spider, and Wolf. And for the most part, it was pretty fun. You go around, kill a bunch of enemies, eventually slay the boss, and then realize you got completely scammed because you dropped nothing. Now, it's not to say that there wasn't any complexity to this mode, but it would be more correct to say that there was an attempt of complexity for this mode. Like, sure, you have all these Slayer-specific items, but when the boss ultimately boils down to just left-clicking on it a couple times until it dies, there's not really a need for any of this stuff. I mean, at the time, outside of Mastiff armor and maybe Tarantula armor, there wasn't really any point in using any of this stuff in the Slayer update here. Outside of course, the Overflux. Now, as stated previously, dragons can be pseudo-monotonous, but it was mostly self-inflicted. However, the Slayer update, to completely max out only one of the Slayers, you had to kill, at an absolute minimum, 2,000 tier 4 bosses. This is before Revenant tier 5, this is before Aatrox, this is before all that stuff. And in an absolute best, you had to kill 2,000 tier 4 bosses in order to max out one of these slayers. And this was like late 2019, early 2020. Yeah, needless to say, it was very, very monotonous. But as we all know, skyblock players are some of the most committed people in the world, and some people actually did go ahead and max out their slayers. And dare I say, some even had fun doing it. Now, you've probably been noticing a pattern here on how the progression of combat has been pretty much a one-for-one link with the general history of skyblock, which I guess should go to show as to how important this skill has been for the game. And the next step in that progression is, of course, the pets updates. In some cases, pets were pretty much what the name would imply, just fun little pets to be hanging around you at all times. But in most cases, there were significant increases to your damage. You know, say you were walking around the graveyard over here and you see a zombie villain, you go ahead and punch it and you get a Jerry to spawn in. But if you had a pet while doing so, you could do 1,400 damage while you're punching the zombies. And it was with the addition of pets that the signature meta here started to shift. It went from the 50 mil Midas sword to the aspect of the dragons. Which is of course the sword that I'm holding in my hand right now, paired with the very real Ender Dragon pet. But once again, with the highly anticipated release of the Dungeons updates, everything changed. As the name would imply, dungeons were you exploring a dungeon. You'd be running around, killing enemies, finding secrets and hidden treasure, and then ultimately finding a final boss at the end. And once again, in typical skyblock fashion, realize that you wasted your time. Now, what made dungeons special was that there was 5 different classes for players to choose from, such as the DPS classes like Mage, Berserk, and Archer here, to Tank obviously being a tank class, and then Healer being the class that nobody picks. You know, every game has to have something that nobody cares about, and the Healer class is the one for skyblock. Now, this was the implied way to play the game. You know, it only makes sense. There are 5 different people in a dungeon party and 5 different classes to choose from, so one can make the logical assumption that, okay, you know, everybody has to have their own unique class. Now, of course, this is hypixel skyblock, and the last thing that people want to do is listen to what the admins tell us. Of course, within hypixel TOS. For the entirety of the normal catacombs, the ideal team composition was pretty much all DPS classes, whether it be all mages, all berserks, or a mix of the two, but ultimately still all entirely DPS. Now, I don't want to spend too much time talking about this skill because Dungeoneering as class is its own specific skill, and Dungeons in and of itself is so expansive that it deserves its own video. But for the most part, with the release of the first 3 floors, combat wasn't really all that revolutionized. I mean, for the most part, superior dragon armor was still on top, and sure, people use stuff like adaptive armor in dungeons, mainly because the kata requirements to use superior was just way too high for people at the time. And certainly within this initial release, there was things like the Bonzo staff that made people think about mage and take it a lot more seriously. And certainly with the release of floor 4 and the Spirit Scepter certainly helped that mage mantra. But what really started the end of the dragon era was the release of floor 5 and all of the loot inside. As much as it's clowned on today, the Shadow Assassin set was truly the first landmark in putting the end of superior dragon's reign. And if that wasn't enough, weapons like the Livid Dagger and the Shadow Fury just completely outclassed everything that came before it, like the Midas and the aspect of the dragons. In addition to this, although this applies to more so dungeons as a whole rather than specifically 4-5, items such as the Fuming Potato books, recombobulators, and crazy fancy reforged stones started appearing. And then after this, floor 6 came out, then there was some things of note, I guess, like the giant sword here and an attempt at necromancy. As we all know, with the release of floor 7, everything changed for skyblock. I've said that like 3 times in this video. Wow, combat truly is one of the most significant skills in the game, as if that wasn't blatantly obvious already. Of course came new armor sets such as Necron armor, which completely blew superior out of the water. There was no ambiguity whatsoever anymore. And some other kind of sort of relevant ones like Gold Ore, I guess. But none were as important as the Storm armor set, especially paired with the signature weapon of the floor, the Hyperion. You know, at this point, everything in the game is revolutionary and groundbreaking and all that type of stuff, but I think we can all unanimously agree that there was a time before the Hyperion and then where we are now. But I mean, the night and day difference cannot be understated. I mean, look at this. I have to physically walk over to the enemies. I have to like look at them to actually hit them, and of course I have modern amenities that are helping me like swing range and all that type of stuff, but think of it as like, you know, I physically have to walk over and click on the enemy and that type of stuff. With the Hyperion, I can just walk along, go along my merry way, you know, teleporting around and do this. And now everything's dead, and I didn't even have to remotely look at anybody. The Wither impact ability is just so supremely broken. I mean, even at the time, it was literally better than what it is now, because the range currently is like, what, 8 blocks or whatever, compared to when it was initially released. It was like 10 or something like that, meaning that, you know, something that's like all the way over there, he can still die, which is just insane. I mean, you can literally just go around AOTE teleporting around everywhere while doing damage, and then every couple of seconds you can get absorption hearts and decrease the damage taken. Considering how relevant this weapon is to the metagame today, it just goes to show how important this weapon was to the time and even to this very day. You can pretty much just right click mage your way through everything in this game except for bosses, but even then that's not even true because of void glooms. And even within those boss fights, it's still a very important healing weapon. It's just arguably the most important item in all of Hypixel Skyblock. And even though the superior dragon set and the 50mm Midas could be considered the face of Hypixel Skyblock in an era previously, in the modern era, it definitely goes to Hyperion. And while there is other important stuff to cover here, such as Master Mode and the Dark Claymore from M7, it really isn't as significant as those initial first 7 floors. And like I said previously, it's going to be delegated to its own separate dungeons video. Now, in the era of the Dwarven Mines, where the mining skill got totally revamped, the admins felt it appropriate to add this little area for the combat skill. They introduced us to Brahmas Beastair, who introduced the Beastair system. It's just a quaint little cottage housed by the Grandma Wolf, which has all the amenities one could need, but ultimately just kind of served as a collectopedia. You have all the different islands, and if you click on them, you have all the different mobs that you've killed, and there's different tiers and all that type of stuff. And when you hit certain milestones, you can get little bonuses like 1,000,000 combat XP, which is nice. Or in some people's case, the worst update ever, because maxing out your Beastair contributes to your skyblock XP, and yeah, that sounds like the absolute worst thing ever. I have zero intention of doing that. Kudos to you people who are insane enough to do that. However, making our way back to Maddox, we finally got a new type of Slayer, Enderman. Now, unlike the previous Slayers, which was just effectively left-clicking until they died, the Voyaglooms actually took a little bit more skill. For one, they were way harder than any of the Slayers previously, although this could mainly be attributed to power creep, but what set them apart was that they had so many unique abilities that took a lot more focus than just simply left-clicking on it. There was the hits phase, where you had to physically hit the enemy in order to take down his health, to other more weird ones like jumping over lasers or standing near beacons, otherwise they'd one-shot you. And this time around, the items were actually good. You could drop the elusive Judgment Core, which sold for way more than any of the previous Slayer boss drops. Or you could use it and craft the Terminator, the best bow in the game. For the most part, I haven't really talked too much about bows because they haven't been too important. Like, one of the most important ones was Runans for a long time there for dragon fights, but that was pretty much it. And then of course there was the whole thing with the bone rangs and how all the archers were like, oh my gosh, how am I going to play the video game now? I'm going to be the worst class in the entirety of the game. And then the Terminator came out, and then now everybody wants to play archer. The drawback to bows and why bone rings were so popular was, pun not intended, was because of the drawback. You know, with the sword or with mage abilities, you're pretty much limited to how fast your CPS is, or however much Hypixel wants to interpret your CPS. But with a bow, you have to slowly draw the bow back in order to get the full crit, because if you're not critting, then who even cares anymore? And it pretty much just resulted in the DPS for bows being ultimately meaningless. But with the short bows, all of those problems are solved. You don't even have to care anymore. It shoots 3 arrows just like the Runans, and you can just run around and deal 8 million damage. That's definitely what that number says. Now, of course, there were updates along the way, such as the Golden Dragon from the Crystal Hollows or the Warden Helmet from Revenant Tier 5, but for the most part, their combat was pretty stagnant. But with the release of the Crimson Isle update, everything changed for the Pasiba. I think you get the point right now. We don't have to go through this again. You know, big update, big changes. The small and pathetic blazing fortress turned into this titan of an island. There, of course, was a lot of content that was added, such as factions, but one of the most important things that could be of note was that normal enemies just running around have over 1,000,000 health. But if you haven't noticed the trend here, with every big update comes a big new boss. But this is not at all as simple as just left click and die boss. You gotta build a giant crossbow, and in order to build the crossbow, you gotta fish out stuff out of the lava. And then in later tiers of the fight, the crossbow doesn't even do anything, it just exists to stun the boss. And then in the final tier of the boss, with this one extra phase where you have to fight in a hellish pit of hell, and there's fire everywhere, and you can get insta-killed, and you gotta do crazy Reaper armor swap strats, and it's just a whole lot of insane, and like, oh my gosh, it's probably impossible. I don't think anybody's ever... Before, it was like, okay, I want to be a big mage with big mage damage. Okay, let me get the storm, max it out, and move on with my life. Oh, I want to do big melee damage or big bow damage. Okay, get a Necron set, max it out, and move on with my life. But this time around, not only did Archer get its own special set in the Terror set tier, but every single one of these Kudra armor sets comes with little attributes. They of course start out with level 1 and eventually max out at tier 10, which can be very noticeable in your stats. And in addition to that, the armor itself could be upgraded, similar to dungeons, although this applied outside of dungeons and went way more. It initially starts out as pretty vanilla without any kind of prefix, but eventually makes its way through the hot tier, burning tier, fiery tier, and eventually the infernal tier, which that itself could be upgraded to the final 15 stars. And if that wasn't enough, there was a sub-menu added here which allowed you to add on equipment here, which added even more stats. But for the most part, that's where we sit today regarding combat. Of course, there are things that I didn't talk about in this video, such as talismans and all that type of stuff, but for the most part, those are pretty superficial. You have talismans, you do big damage. And there are other things that should be mentioned that do deserve a brief shout out here, such as, you know, the Emerald Blade and the whole one for overall thing regarding enchantments. But like I said, most of these are just superficial, and I just wanted to talk about the big major things regarding combat. But like I said, that's pretty much where combat sits today, and overall, I'm very happy with it. I like the approach that the admins have done. I like the fact that they're making combat not just left-click Mob Simulator 2000. I mean, if you do it for long enough, of course, it's going to lead to arthritis and that type of thing, but I think that's our own fault, not the admins. But overall, I think combat is in a very good place right now. It certainly gets a lot more attention from the admins than most of the other skills, mainly because there's a lot more things to do with it. I mean, it's in the name of the game, right? It's PvE, not player versus farm or player versus mental insanity or anything like that. But yeah, those are just my thoughts on the matter. Feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Do you think combat is good? Do you think it's the best skill in the game? Or do you still like alchemy or something like that? You're entitled to your own opinion. I'm not a dictator. But anyways, if you enjoyed this video, then feel free to leave a like and subscribe. That'd be greatly appreciated. And yeah, I'm going to go off and try to get the Coliseum back in order. The game has been too focused on PvE elements. We need to bring back the PvP elements. With the additions like the Hyperion and the Terminator, what could go wrong? It's the greatest idea of all time. Anyways, I'll see you in the next one. Take care.
To